Okay. In this video, we're going to continue on where we left off, where we created our C++ animation blueprint to snap our reticle to the center. Now we're going to smoothen this out. So currently it just, as you can see, snaps to it. Let's go ahead and make a way to actually control the aiming really quick. So in our character here, we're going to create a new Boolean. Call it B is aiming. And we're going to set a new event. So right mouse button, when we press it, we set is aiming to true. And when we release, we set it to false. So this is just going to be how it is for the time being. Eventually, this is going to be event-driven to control everything else. But I just want to simplify it. So that way we can focus on the interpolation portion. What we do is character, because remember we made that blueprint readable, and we're going to check if it's valid. And we're going to check if it's aiming. So is, let's see. Okay, what type is character? Oh, right. So I got to take it and actually cast it. We're going to cast to the first person character. And check if we are aiming. There we go. So let's go ahead and create that variable where we can access it. And we're going to go ahead and set it to correspond to the Boolean we just checked. Go to the animation graph, and here we can tinker around with it. So, actually better yet, let's set this to a float. So we don't have to do any conversions. And we should be able to set it between 0 and 1 by converting. All the same. And then in the anim graph, we can go ahead and get it. And I'll show you kind of what happens when you place it in each one of these. So starting from where it should actually affect it properly. Currently not aiming. I'm currently aiming. So realistically, that's kind of all of where we need it. And it's still everything is attached properly. I disconnect you and move you over to the copy bone. You can see the result of what happens. So when we uncopy the bone, which is what we're doing right now, you don't have any other rotation or anything like that that you require for the socket. And then this one, you're not going to notice really any difference. So we want to set it up for the transform modify bone, where we set the site transform, and then we interpolate is aiming. Okay, so what we're going to do is we need to store a value. We're going to use a float in our animation instance, and then we're going to have a function that runs inside of native update animation that will interpolate it to a new value. So we only want it to happen if we fire off an event to actually change our aiming state. So we're going to have another uProperty. This one's going to be a float. And let's give it a name of aim, let's see, aim alpha, because we're altering an alpha value. And let's go to the animation instance. Set it to 0 in the constructor. And we can actually go ahead and set up some simple functions to call inside of our character for aiming. So that way we don't have to go through and set up actual, events. So it's going to be a U function, blueprint callable, category equals tutorial, then void that aiming, and we're going to pass in a bool is aiming. So instead of having the Boolean on our character, we're going to move it, in our blueprint character, we're going to attach it to our C++ character. So we're going to have a bool B is aiming. We're going to set that to false by default in the constructor. And we're going to use set aiming to modify it. So let's create the implementation and simply do B is aiming to equal is aiming. So now all we want to do instead, let's delete this boolean. Actually, I'm going to remove it out of here because it's going to throw us an error out of the animation blueprint. And when we right mouse button, when we press it, we want to call set aiming and pass in true. When we release it, we want to do the same thing, but pass in false. Let's close down the editor, give it a recompile. Okay, and once that's done, let's reopen the assets. Go to our first person character, and we call set aiming. And we simply pass in true. Copy it, do the same thing for release, but pass in false, like so. And we are good to go. We have that being handled for us in the code. So next up, we want to trigger something in our animation instance telling it, hey, we are now aiming. So we need a way to actually access our animation instance. And since we know we are going to be using our custom one, remove the stuff we're not using anymore. We want to include it. So we're going to include ik animinstance.h, and we can remove our animinstance.h include because we're now using our own. And we want a way to simply get it. So we're going to go ahead and store it. So we have ik animinstance. It's going to be a pointer. This is going to be, let's see, tutorial animinstance. Can't really think of a good name, and unfortunately I included it as the header, which I, again, cannot stand. Class ik animinstance. So let's go ahead and forward declare it up here. Okay, we have it set. Let's go ahead and define it. So inside of begin play, let's go ahead and do our get mesh 1p, get animinstance, and we're going to assign it to that. However, we do need to cast it, so tutorial animinstance equals cast to ik animinstance from, misspelled that, from our current mesh's animation instance. So if you're doing a first and third person mesh setup, or a way where your character has two meshes for the character, such as this has a mesh, which has nothing, but this will be the third person mesh. And then our first person mesh, you would do your switching there. So you would see which one is set to hidden in game, and you would do that and assign it to this variable here. So that will allow you to go through and actually set it up so you don't need to have any custom code running between third and first person. It can all kind of be taken care of on its own. And same thing goes in the example video. When we have the third person mesh actually go to aim, normally it would bring the rifle right to the dead center. So it would be right in the center of his chest, and as you can assume, that would look very unnatural. But instead, it positions the rifle, it has an offset just to the right, so it brings the rifle up to, puts the stock on the shoulder, and then we can use a little bit of bone rotation in the animation blueprint to rotate the head and neck, so it kind of moves the head towards the stock. So anyways, back to what we were doing. We now have our animation instance, and hopefully it is valid. Let's go down to set as aiming. So if tutorial animinstance, what we want to do is call a function on it. So we're going to go through and create a public section. And in here, we want to do void. Let's do set aiming. And we're going to pass it a bool. B is aiming. And handle the logic for interpolation inside of there. So tutorial animinstance, set aiming. We're going to pass in B is aiming. So from here, we want to have some form of check here to kind of tell whether or not we are actually aiming. So the way I ended up going about this was a little bit different. Let me find it. Here it is. So if we scroll down, you can see, because we have this kind of based on events. So in the native update, we're only going to, for example, interpolate relative to hand when we change the site. And then same thing goes with aiming. We are only going to interpolate the aiming if we're actually altering the value. So binterp aiming controls whether or not we interpolate it. So we're not going to have just a simple check. Here we have set as aiming. We want to compare the value between two different ones. So if the value is different, we set whether or not we want to interpolate to true or false. And then if it's set to true, we know we want to interpolate our aiming. So if we are aiming, we bring the site up to the center of our screen. And if is aiming is false, assuming these do not equal each other, the interp aiming is again going to be true. However, we are then going to take the site from the center of our screen and slowly revert back to having it back at our hip. So we're going to increase the alpha and lower the alpha based on the value that we pass in. Then the only time we set binterp aiming to false is if we are at a certain state. So if we are equal to 1, we stop it. If we're equal to 0, we stop it. So that's the idea behind it. We want to have another control boolean here. So it's going to be a bool binterp aiming. And by default, this is going to be false. So on top of that, we can also have well, I guess it wouldn't hurt to have another boolean. We could do this with the actual aim alpha as well, checking its value, but now we're just going to do bool b is aiming, and that's going to actually be set to false as well. And let's assign it. So b is aiming equals is aiming. And we want to do a check, actually. So if b is aiming does not equal is aiming, we want to set binterp aiming equals true. And that's going to be the only time we actually go through and set it to true, in which case the way we tell whether or not we want to increase or decrease the value is we want to set this to equal is aiming. So that's going to be kind of our control. So then on native update animation, we can do our check. So obviously, if character is invalid, we want to return. So if character is invalid, return. So that way we don't have to worry about it or have a bunch of brackets. So if binterp aiming, we want to interpolate our aiming. So we can create a function to do that for us to keep our tick function clean. So void interp aiming. We're just going to simply call it. So if we are set to interpolate, we call interp aiming and have this function handle everything in one place. So now we want to use the Kismet math library to find just some value in that range, so to speak. So we want to slowly increase it. So what we can do is Kismet math library. We search for interp. We have finterp2, which is for floats. So it takes in a current, which would be our current alpha value. Then the target, which would be 0 or 1 based upon b is aiming, delta time, and the interp speed. So we want the current, which is going to be our alpha, which was, what was it, aim alpha. The target, which is going to be b is aiming. So I don't know if it'll cast it for us. So we're going to do a static underscore cast to a float from b is aiming. And then the next parameter is going to be the delta time. So get world, get delta seconds. And then the interp speed, which I'm going to leave at 10. So then this returns a float, which would be our new aim alpha value. So float new alpha, in which case we do a check on it. So if new alpha equals 1, or sorry, is greater than or equal to 1, just in case, or new alpha is less than or equal to 0. However, this comparison is going to fail because any value in the middle is going to trigger it. So if we're greater than or equal to 1, great. Or if we're less than or equal to 0, actually, let me think. My brain. Anyways, for the time being, we're actually going to go ahead and set the alpha. So actually, set aim alpha to it instead. And we'll do the comparison on aim alpha because that's going to be controlled directly. And then just to be sure, we're going to set B is aiming, or B interp aiming to equal false when this is met. So let's see. I think it's greater than or equal to 1, or if it's less than or equal to 0. I feel like I'm being really dumb here. I'm going to print out a login to see how it runs. Alpha %f aim alpha. Let's go ahead and give this a compile. Save everything and give it a relaunch. Now that everything's relaunched, go ahead and open the previous assets, and we are going to just see what this value for alpha is whenever it meets it. So let's try to aim. It says 1, 0. Hold it, says 1, I let go. 0. So it's actually interpolating as it's supposed to. So kind of surprised me a little bit. Anyways, we no longer need to set the is aiming. We're going to use our own variable, so let's delete is aiming and search for aim alpha and link it up, because aim alpha is the float we defined right in here to be blueprint readable. So now, as you can see, we have interpolation to get to where we try to aim. And that's what we wanted. So the same kind of deal applies to when we actually change the optics as well. So we have kind of a final position as to where we want to move the hand and sight and stuff to, and we want to interpolate to that position. We don't want to just, set it initially. Well, we want to set it initially, but we don't want to just immediately set it every time we change optics. So in the next video, we're going to set up a way to change what optics we set. And then in the next video after that, we're probably going to go through and interpolate it. So for the time being, I'd say we are pretty good. That is working as intended. And we can even go through, and I already know it's going to work if we change the current optic to be something else, to like a different element in it. So let's actually try that real quick. So we're going to set current optic to be, I'll actually set it to be the very last one. Okay, so that is right at the root. So that is incorrect. That should be the static mesh, right? We'll do it at the complete, where it's completed. Oops. Get the optic. Let's do get. We're going to get index 1. Now we're at the top optic. And if we do index 2, we get the right optic. And as you can see, it rotates itself to match it and align perfectly. So we know our system is good to go. However, I noticed an issue. I think we need to set that to 2 for the last index. I think it was creating a, I don't know what it was doing. Do we still have it? Yeah, we do. So that was the reason why. So we were just essentially adding and attaching a optic to a place that didn't exist because we did one too many. Okay. So that's going to be all for this video. In the next one, as I stated, we're going to go through and set it up to where we can change what optic we are looking through. And then after that, we want to interpolate that change so when we switch, it is smooth instead of snapping, as you will see in the next video, which is, it's pretty rough. Anyhow, if you like what I'm doing and you want to support me, you can find a link to my Patreon down in the description below, where I have a link, where I have a Team Deathmatch series just for Patrons, as well as you get early access to all of my videos, such as this one. If you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to join my Discord that's also linked down below, and I will try to help you out. So, I'll see you in the next video.